this afternoon, we're thrilled to have David Grand with us, who is the founder and developer of the Brainspotting Method. And David has been worked at after 9/11. And I don't know if you saw the piece of artwork outside. Did you? Isn't that funny? John Coburn, who's from Canada, did a lot of sketching. He came to New York right after 9/11 and created these incredible sketches, and he's given us copies of all of them. And Stephanie from our staff was coordinating, hanging the pieces of artwork up last night, and she said, "Oh my gosh, here's David Grand." So here we are 16 years later, and you're an institution. As far as being down there, yeah, we have proof that you were down there then, David, working. And he's also worked after Newtown extensively with the Newtown families. So, and I was introduced to David more recently by Deb Delvecchio had mentioned that you were hosting a two-day conference in Newtown that I attended. And I was actually one of his I was going to say patients, but I guess it was a demonstration. And it was an incredible experience. And I went back. It was interesting because I was speaking in Paris at an international conference for victims of crime. And I had a friend die, which delayed my, I wanted to attend her funeral. And so I left later than I should have to fly to Paris for this conference, and so I was completely off kilter as far as my body clock, and didn't have time to recuperate, and then came back and went to this two-day conference. And when I showed up at work on Monday, Stephanie looked at me and she said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so surprised, you look so relaxed." Well, I really attribute it to going to that conference and being one of, I'll say, one of his patients as he was demonstrating. So with further ado, I want to invite David to come up, and he'll present Brainspotting.
Mary, that's the first time I've ever been called an institution. And I'm still trying to figure out what it means. In our group today, how many of you are family members? How many of you are survivors? And first responders? And what I learned in the conference that I presented at for Mary is that second responders are people like myself, who did a lot of trauma work and had the secondary exposure. We have any therapists, counselors, or second responders? Okay. How many of you have even heard the name Brainspotting before? Okay, a few, not too many. And of those of you who've heard about it, have you ever heard more, ever had an experience with Brainspotting? Okay. Let's see. I want to go back to this watchword here, where you look affects how you feel. And the discovery of Brainspotting is based on the fact that where we actually look does access different parts of our brain, especially the deeper brain, So I'd like to do just a 20-30 second exercise with you all here to give you a sense of the fact of what it means that where you look affects how you feel. I want you to think of something that's mildly, annoying to you, or something that's bothering you today. Not everybody in the room has some very significant things. But just think of something that's bothering you, and then look off at something to your right, and just sort of pause there for about 5 or 10 seconds. Now look off to your left, and just look there for around 5 or 10 seconds. Just notice if you feel in any way a difference, could be emotionally, physically, or otherwise. Anybody feel any different looking left or right? Okay, some of you. Probably would need more time and more activation to guide it. But in this context, our visual systems are directly linked into the deepest parts of the brain. I want to introduce just two words, two concepts about the brain. People have used them somewhat today. We have the neocortex, which means the new cortex, which is really right on the top, especially in the front, especially off to the left, which is, and again, we've had some wonderful, eloquent, informed presenters before. The neocortex is is only humans have. Primates have a neocortex, but the human neocortex is much more evolved than primates. All other animals, mammals, and reptiles have no neocortex. It's where the thinking processes are. It's where the capacity for language is. And again, Deb spoke about this. And it's where the ability to understand time, to know the difference between the past, the present, and the future all exist. And underneath the neocortex is the rest of the brain, which we call the subcortex because it's below the neocortex. The part of the brain that's right below the neocortex is the mammalian brain, also called the limbic brain or the limbic system. You've heard those words this morning. And all mammals have this part of the brain, from a mouse to a giraffe. And this is really where a lot of the emotions are. The response to threat is the capacity to bond. The maternal instincts are all in this mammalian brain, this limbic brain. And that sits on top of the brainstem, which is known as the reptilian brain, or some people have other names for it than that. That is where all the core bodily functions are mediated. The autonomic nervous system is in the brainstem. So when I talk about the subcortex, I'm talking about that mammalian brain underneath the neocortex that goes right into the brainstem. Okay. Now, again, you've had a good amount of preparation from some of the previous presenters here. When a person is traumatized, they get traumatized not in the neocortex, because the neocortex has language, has thought, has context, has time. But it's underneath that neocortex in the subcortex where the trauma is experienced. And so in order to have psychotherapies be successful in working with trauma, they have to be able to access the parts of the brain that don't have language and don't have thought, that come primarily from intuition, from emotion, and body experience. Okay. Now, the neocortex is important, has its role when it comes to trauma, being traumatized and healing from trauma. But a psychotherapy that goes directly to the neocortex or does not reach into the subcortex is limited in its capacity to heal the traumas that a person experiences. I'll just give a quick review of what happens in the brain when we're traumatized. The brain is a phenomenal processing mechanism. It has 1 quadrillion synaptic connections. 1 quadrillion is 1 billion multiplied by 1 million. That's how many synaptic connections there are in the brain. What does that tell us? Well, that the brain is, and Daniel Amen says that there's more synaptic connections in the brain than there are stars in the universe, which means we actually have an internal universe. But why do we have this incredibly vast, infinite, complex brain? It's because it has to process so much. Okay. For mammals, they have a lot to process. If you have dogs or cats or ferrets or other animals, there's a lot of brain power going on there because they know how to function, they know how to stay alive, they intuitively know what to do. I always wonder if you're watching your pet, a dog or a cat, and they're just sitting there, and then all of a sudden they get up and they walk over to the other side of the room and they sit down, Like, what was the process by which they decided, hey, I've had enough time here, I'm going to go over there. Again, without language, it's all intuitive, okay? That's the intuitive brain. But the brain has to process so much information all the time, the human brain especially, because we're processing everything that's coming up from our bodies, and we're processing all of our emotions and all of our relationships, and we're processing how we interact, how we perceive, and how we interact with the world. In that context, you need that kind of infinitely vast and complex processing power that the brain provides. And it allows us to do amazing things, whether it's to dance on stage or whether it's to play baseball, hit a ball coming in at 100 miles an hour, or to sit in front of somebody and listen to them and be able to provide healing for them, or to fix the plumbing in your house or apartment. But what happens is, when a person experiences a trauma, especially a significant or a profound trauma, the brain's capacity to process gets overwhelmed. Okay, it's a lot easier to be a mechanic on an engine of a Ford or a Chevy from the 1950s, but to be a mechanic for a Ferrari engine from 2017 is so complex that it's almost impossible for us to do. And our brain is like that Ferrari engine. It easily breaks down. So what happens is, when we get traumatized, the brain's capacity to process the traumatic experience breaks down. The traumatic experience is not fully processed in the brain, but that's in the subcortical brain. That's in the part of the brain with no language and no thought and no time. So what happens is, pieces of that trauma are left unprocessed in the subcortical brain. And everybody here knows trauma, and most of in this room know it profoundly. That's the brain explanation of what causes us to experience the symptoms of trauma, of PTSD. It is unprocessed traumatic experience in the deepest parts of the brain. And what symptoms does that cause? Well, a flashback, if you see or hear or smell something that happened 16 years ago, that's that unprocessed traumatic information coming alive, okay? And it's coming online, and what happens is, because it wasn't processed, when you see it or hear it or smell it, you actually feel like you're back in that situation. Okay, that's because the brain was overwhelmed and couldn't process through the experience sufficiently, okay? Now that makes healing it, and that's why trauma symptoms, some of them get better, but some of them persist. And when people are suffering with chronic trauma, repeated trauma or profound unhealed trauma, some of the symptoms keep going, such as also hypervigilance or fear of reoccurrence. Fear of reoccurrence means that you're afraid it's going to happen again. Okay, even if you know that it's unlikely that it's going to happen again, the system, because it's holding that experience, is still feels like it's going to happen. It's going to happen, and it's going to happen soon, because the information is unprocessed in the brain. So in that context, in order to heal, and one of the presenters this morning talked about having I forget his name, the gentleman from the FBI, Tom. Tom talked about how he went on with these symptoms, and he experienced EMDR, which does address subcortical trauma in a way similar but also very different to Brainspotting. What happened for him is that his brain was able to process through a lot more of that traumatic experience and have it not be unprocessed and stuck there. Brainspotting, just that little thing, where you look affects how you feel. Brainspotting gets access to the unprocessed trauma in the deep brain, in the subcortical brain, through the way that we orient visually. The visual system, more than half the brain is involved in vision, which is really important for us to know, because excuse me, so much of our brain is involved in vision, that vision and our eyes is a way that information goes out and information comes in. So in Brainspotting, we really look very carefully to see where a person is looking when they're talking about the trauma. We look to see if we go across their visual field and they're activated around the trauma. We look for reflexes. If a person's head goes back right on the spot, it tells us that there's something there. If a person is telling us the story of the trauma and they're talking passionately to a spot on the floor, it tells us there's something there in their visual field. And if a person is activated and over here they feel it a little bit, over here they feel it somewhat, and over here it's intense, it tells us something about this eye position is accessing that unprocessed trauma in the subcortical brain. Now, I have a lot of information here, and I'm not going to dwell too much on it, and I'd like to even have a chance at the end, maybe for 5 minutes of questions or comments. I know we have time issues here, so I'm going to be expeditious. This is my book. It came out 4 years ago, and it's for the general public as well as for professionals. The study here is done. There's a study unbeknownst to me that of all the different healing modalities that have been used in Newtown, and every one of these modalities is an excellent modality. So I don't want to give the impression that, oh, this one's better than that and we're in competition. There's no competition really when it comes to healing. And if there ever is, something's wrong that's coming from a different place. Anyhow, Brainspotting was found to be the most effective of all the therapies that has been used up in Newtown. And I have been fortunate enough to give a number of trainings up there for the therapists. And I go up once every month or two to the Resiliency Center of Newtown and do, sessions with local people. It's really interesting, having done a lot of work with 9/11 survivors and now work with Newtown survivors, the absolute commonalities and the absolute differences. And of course, some of that is individual, but a lot of that really is that there's something about these existential traumas that just is the same for everybody who experiences them. But each traumatic event is also different for the survivors. We have a lot of psychological research with Brainspotting, and it's growing all the time. I have 2 new studies that just came out that they're not even here because they're so recent. So this one had a sample size of 77. It was done internationally out of Germany through Spain, Portugal, and the United States. This was the original study we had there. We also have 2 articles that done by myself and Frank Cargan that speculate how brainspotting works in the brain. And the name Brainspotting was not randomly chosen. It's chosen because it is a brain-based therapy. It's also a body-based therapy, and it's also a mindfulness-based therapy, and it's a relational therapy. So it takes together all the different components of psychotherapy. Anyhow, this paper really Frank is an amazing brain genius, and he taught me all kinds of terms and concepts I didn't even know before that we now help us to understand that Brainspotting gets access all the way down to the brainstem, to the visual centers down in the brainstem and the occipital cortex. And it explains to us why looking in a certain direction and processing in that direction helps you to release this unprocessed trauma. We're very international. These are all the countries where we've had Brainspotting trainings. And I'm very proud that I have trainers around the world who teach Brainspotting in the language of each country. And we're going to have a presentation on cultural issues here. And in that context, it's really important that when you train a modality, that if you train it in Japan or you train it in Brazil, that it's not an American modality, that the people translate it by language and by culture into what is meaningful and organic and attuned for the people in each particular country. This is my website. You can go on it here. There is a way that you can contact me here through the website. There's an information thing that goes right to my assistant, and she alerts me to it right away. So that's the way to get to me directly. I'll run through this quickly. It was in 2003. I was doing a session with an ice skater who was stuck on the jump called a triple loop. For all of us here, the concept of doing a triple loop is not the hardest of all the triple jumps that skaters do. So ironically, she could do all the other ones. She couldn't do a triple loop. I like to say for all of us here, the only way we could think about doing a triple turn on the ice is if we slip on the ice and turn around 3 times on the way down. I'm not able to tell that joke when I'm in Florida, by the way, which they have their own issues right now. But anyhow, so she would do it, jump up in the air, turn around once, twice, and instead of that third turn, she would, what they call, pop out of it. She'd come out of the jump. She could not get herself to do that third turn. And I had worked with her for a year. She had done great work. It was a combination of EMDR and somatic experiencing and other kind of body work. But this is what she was stuck on. So I had her imagine herself just doing that jump and turning around once, twice, and then I slowly went across her visual field, and when I got over here, her eye went like this. And I started like this, and then her eye just froze, and it locked up right on my finger. I had no idea what was happening, but she started to, all of a sudden, now I'd done a year's worth of really good, intense work with her. She started to process one trauma after another, new traumas we never got to. A lot of family strife, divorce, maternal rejection, all this kind of stuff. And then the things that we had really worked through before opened up again and processed through to a deeper level. That's what really got my attention, because I thought that this deep, intensive work had really gotten to everything, and I discovered that there was deeper levels, deeper strata to it. She called me up the next morning from the skating rink. She went to practice every morning at 5 o'clock. Not too many of us would have the wherewithal to do that. And she was very excited. She said, "David, I just did a triple loop, no problem." And I went out, I did it again and again and again, and she never had a problem with that. So for me, it's like, well, what is this? What happened? And as a therapist with many decades of experience, and also someone who's both creative and also scientific, I wondered, was this like a one-off? Was this something just with her? Or is this something that has application to more people? Maybe this has application to everybody. So I started to look, with all my other clients, as I'd go across, I started to look for eye wobbles, eye freezes, blinks, heads going back, squinting, all these things. Every time I saw it, I stopped there, and the person went into a deeper, more focused kind of processing, which now, as I introduced it, meant that we were going deeper and deeper into the subcortex, all the way down to the brainstem, and perhaps even all the way down into the spine, to spinal processes. Again, every time I saw a reflex, I stopped, even simple ones. Get across here, a person would blink twice, I just stopped, and they would start to go into this deeper, mindful processing that became more and more bodily. So now, a lot of my clients are therapists, and therapists who do similar work to what I do. So I didn't tell them about my discovery. I just did it. I looked for it, and I said, okay, just see what happens over here. And all of them went into a deeper, more profound processing than they had gone into before. So afterwards, they said, okay, give it up. What is this? And I told them about the ice skater. I didn't say, try it out with your clients, but I kind of had a feeling that they would. So they went back into their practices, and they started to try it with clients, and they'd come back the next week and the week after, and they were saying, I wasn't having any problems before. I was very successful, but certain things are happening now that were not happening before. And so I started observing it, and I started getting this feedback. So over the course of like 2 to 4 weeks, I had the information that told me that something about this was breakthrough technology. And like I said, that first discovery was with a reflex. But then with other discoveries, I saw that certain clients, I'd be looking for a reflex, and I'd go like this, like this, like this. And the client said, "You missed it." I say, "You missed it?" I said, "What do you mean?" "It's back that way." I say, go back, right over there." I say, "Well, how do you know it's over here?" They said, "Because I feel it right over here. Right when you got there, I just felt it right here." So my clients told me that besides the reflexes, what they felt on the inside was another way of finding these eye positions. But then the third way that I was telling you about before was this guy who was just talking to a spot on the floor. And all of a sudden I realized, I guess that's a brain spot. And I said, just keep looking over there, because you maintain the gaze. Once you find the spot, and we use pointers, you just keep on looking at it and go into a mindfulness process. And so I guided him to do that over there, and he had some profound healing off of this, what I call a gaze spot, because it's where he was gazing. So outside window is working with reflexes. Inside window is working with where the person's felt sense is of where they feel it the most. And gaze spotting is just by where we look naturally. Now, in the trauma field, and in for those of us who work with survivors of what I call existential trauma, like 9/11, like Newtown, like Katrina, Houston now, and hopefully no worse than necessary in Florida, there's a thing called the 1,000-mile stare. It's also known as the 1,000-yard stare, the 100-yard stare, okay, where the person's just looking off like this. And you see that a lot with people after these existential traumas, natural disasters, and also with combat veterans, okay? And it is seen as being a sign that the person is dissociated or out of it, or that they're not present. And in reality, it is anything but the case. It is a gaze spot. And the person is not just looking off into space, they're really looking at something. They're not aware of it, they may not be consciously seeing it, but that spot for them holds what it is. And if the person had some heavy-duty combat in Fallujah, they may literally, in that gaze, be back there in Fallujah, but they're not out of it. They're really into it. The fact is they're so deep into it that it seems like they're not present or they're dissociated. Those are great ways to access eye positions that can get right to where that combat or the other traumatic experience is held deep in the brain. And then from there to process it. Here's the thing. To understand how you heal from trauma is if you understand that trauma is unprocessed information in the deep subcortical brain, well then, how do you get it to process? If you can find it, and brain spotting finds it through eye positions, there are other modalities that do it differently. If you can find it and hold it there, if the person goes into a mindfulness process, we call it processing in psychotherapy, that is the brain healing in the present what it wasn't able to heal at the time or process through at the time. It's processing now what you couldn't process, whether it was 5 years ago or 16 years ago. And it doesn't mean like once you process it like it didn't happen, because the brain always knows what happens. But what happens is instead of it feeling like it's happening now, it starts to feel like it happened in the past. And the meaning of it is part of where we have been, part of what has happened to us, as opposed to if we feel like it's happening right now, it doesn't have any meaning, except I'm suffering and I have to survive and I have to get by from this moment to the next moment. So the whole thing about whether it's outside window from reflexes, inside window from what you feel on the inside, or gaze spotting just like this, is that when you find the spot that gets you to where the unprocessed trauma is, you have a chance to process it now in the present. Sometimes it happens fast, sometimes in 1 or 2 sessions. Sometimes it takes a lot longer. Sometimes it can take 5 sessions, 20 sessions, or longer, especially if the person has a history of childhood trauma. But the thing is, you can process in the present a lot and sometimes most of what was unprocessed from the past. That's what this is about. I said there are 1 quadrillion connections in the brain. Just look at that number up there. Now, even the people sitting all the way in the back, try to see that whole number at the same time and take it in. You can't even process the number, that's how vast it is, for the synaptic connections in the brain. One of the problems with psychotherapy historically is that the therapist has to know best. The therapist has to know, they have to know the information, they have to take the history so they can form the diagnosis, so they can set the treatment plan. The only problem is it leaves the client out in the process. The fact is, once you know that the brain is infinitely vast and complex, you know that you can't know what's going on inside of that person who's sitting in front of you unless or until they tell you or discover it inside of themselves. So the uncertainty principle, I took the name from Heisenberg with quantum physics, means that the therapist sits in front of the client in a state of uncertainty. We teach clients you don't know anything. We teach therapists that you don't know anything. That's what we do in the trainings. And from there, then we see, well, what can you know? What can you do? If you've ever seen a therapist and they didn't get you, and they said, no, it's not that, it's this, or they started to talk to you about things, and it really was not resonating with who you are and what your experience was or is, they are coming from certainty. Now remember, our brains are so complex that nobody else can know what's inside of it unless you wait and listen and set the circumstances for it to come out. Socrates said, I know one thing, I know nothing, and that's the uncertainty principle. Now, I said that there are 4 components to brain spotting. It's relational, it's brain-based, it's body-based, and it's mindfulness-based. But the most important part of it is that it's relationally based, and it's based on relational attunement and presence. Okay? A therapist who doesn't know that much but really is very attuned and present will be a lot more helpful than a therapist who's brilliant and knows all this stuff but is not attuned and present. Obviously, it's best to have all of that. But in order to heal, especially from trauma, especially from profound trauma, existential trauma, devastating trauma, you need someone who sits there, who's totally present, totally open, but tunes into who you are. And you can't know how to do that. You have to sit there in uncertainty and listen and follow the client wherever they go. So what we do in brain spotting, and for some of you this is, if you're clinicians, this is technical stuff you can understand. If you're not, I want you to just get the concept here. We use what's called a dual attunement frame. In other words, you're present with attunement with the client, and you're also aware of what's going on with their eyes, and also what's going on in terms of what they're feeling. So you're attuned to them relationally, and you're attuned to them brain-body-wise. It's those 2 attunements together that set a frame that where the therapist sits and holds and sets that frame, and then the client processes and goes wherever they go. And you don't, as the therapist, you have no idea where it's going. You don't control it. You just sit there and you follow it and you trust it, and you teach the person in front of you to trust their own processing. The reason we have the dual attunement frame is because of the uncertainty. If you can't know what's inside of the person, well, then what are you going to do? Well, you set this frame around them, and then you watch what happens. And the human capacity to heal starts to take over. Sometimes very slowly, sometimes very quickly, sometimes very subtly, sometimes very powerfully and dramatically. And what goes on, again, like I said, once a person's on the spot, we just watch and we see what happens and see where they go, and it's a form of mindfulness. We had our mindfulness expert here before, the Benson Clinic up at Mass General. I presented up there. He's a great guy. The program is an amazing program. I even went into a little trance during the exercise that we did here before, and that's not so easy for me to do. But the mindfulness in brain spotting is a special kind of mindfulness. It's focused mindfulness, because you're activated around the issue or the trauma, and you're aware of where you're feeling it in your body, and we have found a spot that it really resonates into your subcortical brain, and you're holding that there. So the mindfulness that you do is in a state of high focus, and that's what makes it very efficient and very effective. Not so important. Okay. This, again, is the model for brain spotting. The client is like the head of the comet, and the therapist tries to get in the tail of the comet and tries to stay in the tail of the comet. The processing that goes on for any human being, but especially a trauma survivor, in a session is a trajectory, and the person always goes further and faster than the therapist can follow. So we just try to follow the client wherever they go. A lot of psychotherapies, it's modeled where the head of the comet is the therapist and the client is the tail that follows them, but it doesn't work that way, because when you have 1 quadrillion connections that are so vast and so fast, okay, you can't get ahead of it as the therapist. You have to follow the client wherever they go, and we call it staying in the tail of the comet. Brain spotting is really more a physiological process than a psychological process. And we say that brain spotting, BSP is the acronym, is accordingly seen as a physiological approach with psychological consequences. Okay? So we're really we're working with physiology first and psychology second. And physiology meaning all brain and body, neurophysiology. We already covered this. Quickly put, we are creatures of regulation. Our brains are geniuses of regulation. And the brain is always operating to help us to stay regulated and to notice when we're out of regulation and to bring ourselves back into regulation. Why does a person need to go to psychotherapy? Because they are dysregulated, they are out of regulation, and something is preventing them from getting back into regulation. Well, if you have unprocessed trauma in your deep brain, that is going to prevent you from being able to re-regulate yourself enough. You may be able to do your job, you may be able to take care of your children, you may be able to do all kinds of things, but you're still struggling and suffering at the same time, you know? And it comes out in one way or another in your life. So the process of all psychotherapy is to help people to move from dysregulation towards regulation. I've already really covered this about trauma, so I'm going to zip through this a little bit. Stop there if there's, the unprocessed trauma in the subcortical brain is it's like in a capsule form. In other words, there are barriers around it. And this is what makes it so hard to treat, because the brain takes the trauma and surrounds it with a protective dissociative barrier so that you can function, so that the rest of the brain can go on. Now, this is how we survive trauma, but at the same time, it prevents us from healing trauma, because those dissociative barriers hide the trauma from the brain. This is where you've had a traumatic experience and you don't have some of the memory of it or all of the memory of it. It can happen in a car accident, happens a lot in combat trauma. So the idea is, if you have this unprocessed trauma in capsule form, an eye position, blink, 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 chest tightens, or you're locked over here, helps us to find that the capsule, and then holds the focus on the capsule, so the processing can begin to gently go into that capsule and start to process what's held there. And it's really like, the capsules, the time capsules, where you take all the artifacts of the day and bury it to dig it up 100 years later, 300 years later. The information is buried at the time of the trauma. And when you open it up, it's like opening up a time capsule, which then allows you to know what's there and allows you to heal what's there. Trauma is very isolating. This was on one of the slides of a previous presenter. I was really thrilled to see that artwork with the quote from me on there. At the Resiliency Center of Newtown, there's a quote from me just that you see as you leave the building there, and it says, "We are traumatized alone, but we heal together." And by the way, you can write that down, Mary, and nothing speaks better for voices of 9/11 than that idea. We are traumatized alone. Even if you're in a group, trauma is isolating. But you can't heal in that isolation. You have to heal together. That's why, family therapy, groups such as Voices of 9/11 are so crucial for healing as well. 9/11 survivors, okay? It's different than if your house burned down, okay? It's different than if you lost a son in a car accident, Why? Because it's so public. This whole thing about being a 9/11 survivor is like a tag, And it's like if, someone finds out, well, you had this trauma, and someone, oh, that's too bad, I'm sorry for your loss, and so on. But when people find out you're a 9/11 survivor, you get a totally different reaction, or a Newtown survivor. All of a sudden it's, you get treated differently. When you are a survivor of existential trauma, you get put into a group or a category, which means you don't get seen for who you are. And each person's trauma, and this again was stated numerously before, each person's trauma is different and is experienced differently, even if it's 5 people experiencing the same thing at the same time. There's the commonality, but there's the individual differences. There's also I worked with so many 9/11 survivors again, and it's the public nature of it, you know? And again, people hear it and react to it differently. And what we need really to survive is to be seen for who we are and what we've gone through. Someone else referenced the idea of the unhelpful things that are said to us as survivors, okay? And I've often said to 9/11 survivors, Newtown survivors, and so on, especially people who lost loved ones, that you could write a book about all the stupid things that were said to you, you know? And all the things that were intended to be helpful, but actually were not helpful, were even hurtful. That's another aspect of what you go through. And what you need is just to be accepted for who you are, for what you have gone through, and to have somebody be there if and when you need them, as opposed to in your face or like pulling away, you know, not wanting to have anything to do with you. This is really important in terms of understanding your own traumatic experiences, especially existential ones, collective traumas. Who you were the day before the trauma determines how you experience the trauma and who you are after the trauma. Who you were 1 minute before 9/11 determines how you experienced your 9/11 loss or exposure, okay, which is different from person to person. This we see it with combat veterans. Who comes back and experiences the worst PTSD, the most chronic, debilitating PTSD? Not just the ones who had the worst exposure, but the ones who carried in trauma into the combat, okay? People who were survivors of developmental or childhood trauma, especially abuse as soldiers, are the ones who have the worst PTSD, even with less exposure. The same thing goes for going through 9/11, Katrina, Newtown, okay? If you are carrying a lot of personal trauma, and it could be childhood trauma, or it could be that you've had other profound losses in your life, you know, unexpected, tragic losses, it's going to make your experience of this, that yourself, your neurobiology, is going to go into this situation and process it from who you are and where you've been. And this is why a lot of times you need to go back to prior traumas and do trauma processing, brain spotting, or other modalities in order to be able to heal from that existential trauma that you went through on 9/11 or these other circumstances. And every trauma is a re-traumatization going back to childhood trauma. So what happens is, and we saw this there with, you know, the hunting accident, you know, FBI has the exposure to that unspeakably horrific, traumatizing room with all the children in it, and it brought him back to that trauma 13 years earlier. So everybody gets traumatized in life, you know. This is not the most welcoming, friendly, safe world, you know, so that since every trauma is a re-traumatization going back to the original childhood traumas, the 9/11 trauma is a re-traumatization, no matter what. It may be an obvious re-traumatization or it may be a subtle re-traumatization. But it's important to know that about yourself and know that in terms of how to heal from it. Okay? So, collective healing, okay, we're doing right here, right now, you know, 2 days before the 16th anniversary, you know. When Monday comes, we'll be different because we were here today and here tomorrow, you know, and because we were here together. And it's something that's shared experience for all of us in so many different ways, from family members and survivors and first responders and second responders. We're here together around this. We're not alone. We're not isolated, which happens with trauma. But at the same time, individual focus and healing is necessary and important to heal traumas, especially the most profound ones. So we really need both. I think we have time for a few questions or comments, Mary. Are we, is that okay? 2 questions. 1, 2. Yeah.
When you say every trauma is a re-traumatization going back to childhood trauma, how are you defining childhood trauma?
I'm not some can be small trauma. We heard the term micro trauma. Some could be macro traumas. Sometimes it's cumulative traumas. But it really is what it is for the individual. A lot of times there's issues in the original maternal relationship or caretaker relationship. Sometimes the traumas happen from siblings. Sometimes it happens from the loss of a grandparent or a severe illness that happens to the child or to a family member, accidents, other kind of things like this. So I would not define that. You know, it's really kind of self-defined. Did I answer your question enough, or is there another component to it? Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Three-part question. How long has Brainspotting been in existence? Does Brainspotting help with fear issues and ancestral traumas? Does Brainspotting parallel in any way with NLP and comparable results?
Mary, can I have another 3 hours? Wonderful questions. I discovered Brainspotting in 2003, so it's 14 years, which is really infancy for a healing modality. And Brainspotting now is really different than it was 14 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. We keep on evolving it, and I have so many wonderful people co-contributing. Ancestral issues. We don't give enough recognition to the fact that trauma gets passed on from generation to generation, and that it goes way back. One of my trainers has her own modality called somatic archaeology that goes back 7 generations and looks at how it's carried through in the body. Any therapist should be mindful of generational trauma or ancestral trauma. And if they're not, they're going to miss it, you know. And people intuitively know it, but people sometimes need to have it be reflected to them. So because Brainspotting gets into the deepest parts of the brain, those are the parts of the brain that hold the ancestral trauma, as well as the connections through the brainstem into the body. The body really holds the ancestral trauma. So the more attuned any therapist, especially Brainspotting therapist, is to ancestral trauma, the more you'll be able to get to that. Some of that will process through without a person even knowing it, because it's so deep. It's so deep. What was the third part of your question?
How does Brainspotting, or does Brainspotting parallel in any way with NLP?
Okay. I wouldn't compare it per se. It's not for me to compare. It's for others to compare. NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, is a very effective modality that was developed about 25, 30 years ago, maybe more, and where different eye positions, there's a lot to it, but different eye positions are matched with different experiences. So you would say for this issue, you would look up and to your right, or for this issue, up, down, and down and to your left. The difference there is that Brainspotting, we have no preconceived map. We go into it totally blank, that's the uncertainty principle, and look for not just where the spot is, but for where the spots are. Okay. In your second question, you referenced fear, right? Now fear is a good thing. Okay. Fear is mammalian. Fear is what alerts us to potential danger. Deb Wesselman mentioned the amygdala. That's the fire alarm box that goes off that tells us that there's danger. Like if you hear an explosion, you should be afraid, orient towards where it is, and then find out what's going on, and then head off in the other direction. We heard the terms fight or flight. I like to say better flight or fight, because the first human response to threat is to create distance from it. Okay? So if there's a predator over there, you want to go in the opposite direction, create as much space. That's flight. But if you can't escape the predator, and the predator has you cornered, that's when you go into fight. Fear is the manifestation, is the experience that something's wrong, and you got to run, and if you can't run, you got to fight. Okay, so it's part of our hard mammalian wiring for survival. The problem is that neocortex gets all screwed up with this stuff. And when a mammal comes out of that fear state, if they survive, just calms down, and they forget about it, and they're fine. Humans, that neocortex got offline and now is having trouble getting back online. And this is another definition of trauma, where the person is reacting in the present to something that happened in the past. And fear is one of the most powerful markers of that. But because if you get to unprocessed trauma in the deeper subcortical brain, and you help it to process through, that fear that's coming because that it feels like it's happening right now begins to go back and back and back into the then and there instead of the here and now. Thank you for your questions. Thank you all. For those of you who are clinicians, therapists, or counselors, I have a few handouts for training in early November, so it's over here, so please come in and get them. And I'll put some on the table as well.